Israel's defense minister quits after a ceasefire stops a deluge of airstrikes and Hamas rockets. But after so many broken agreements, is there any hope the deal between the two sides will hold? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmaker is the flare-up over Gaza. A botched raid, hundreds of rockets in one direction, airstrikes in another. They've once again put any prospect of an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal in peril. The latest conflict has led to casualties in Israel and the Gaza Strip. But why now, when Israel and Hamas had been close to reaching a peace agreement which would have included badly needed aid for Gaza? Many analysts say internal politics are at fault. Avigdor Lieberman has quit Netanyahu's government in protest, saying the truce was giving in to terror. And reports say Hamas is feeling the heat from militant factions who are upset negotiations with Israel are taking place. So, is peace possible when peace itself is a political liability? That debate in a moment. First, here's Haider Abbasi.
The Gaza Strip under attack. Israeli airstrikes batter the Palestinian territory, damaging buildings and killing 6 people. The air raids follow hundreds of rockets fired into Israel by armed groups in the Strip. One of the rockets damaged a bus carrying soldiers in southern Israel. It's the worst violence between Israel and Gaza since 2014. But what provoked the attacks? This is what's left after a raid by Israeli special forces. Hamas, which governs Gaza, says the Israelis infiltrated an area near the southern city of Khan Yunis. Hamas says Israeli commandos traveling in a car targeted its members. When the fighters followed the vehicle, an Israeli aircraft fired missiles in the area. Hamas says that allowed the commandos to escape back into Israel. 7 Palestinians were killed, including Hamas commander Noor Baraka. Israel says one of its soldiers was killed in the attack. Since March, there have been weekly protests by Palestinians in Gaza near the border with Israel. They're demanding the right to return to lands they were expelled from when Israel was created in 1948. At least 200 protesters have been killed and thousands more wounded by Israel's military. But there have been efforts to ease tensions. Egypt, Qatar and the United Nations have been trying to negotiate a long-term truce between Israel and Hamas. And progress was being made. On Friday, Israel allowed Qatar to deliver much-needed fuel and money to Gaza. The coastal territory has been under a crippling siege by Israel and Egypt for 11 years. The economy is on the verge of collapse.
The Israeli enemy isn't interested in calm or an end to the Gaza blockade. The Israeli occupation is the one responsible for this ugly crime and these stupid actions.
The result has been widespread hardship. Palestinians in Gaza have power only for a few hours a day, and unemployment is at 50%. Despite Israel withdrawing its soldiers from Gaza in 2005, it still controls the airspace, borders and sea around the territory. Since then, Israel has launched 3 military assaults on Gaza. The last one in 2014 killed 1,462 Palestinians and wounded 18,000. The most recent violence has ended in a ceasefire that's divided Israel's government.
I'm here to announce my resignation from the role of the Defence Minister of the State of Israel. The question which needs to be asked is why specifically now? As far as I'm concerned, yesterday's ceasefire, together with the entire process of reaching an arrangement with Hamas, is a capitulation to terror.
So what was the purpose of Israel's most recent raid in Gaza? And is a long-term ceasefire between Hamas and Israel now under threat? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. We're joined from Tel Aviv by Danny Ayalon. Danny is Israel's former deputy foreign minister. He was once the ambassador to the United States. In Gaza, we have Mukhaymar Abu Sada. He's a professor of political science at Al-Azhar University. And in Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, Umar Shakir is there for us. Umar is the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. Thank you to all three of you for your time. Danny, let's start with the very latest news, the political fallout from this, and Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's defense minister, resigning over a ceasefire. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he's gearing up for elections. He's been under a lot of criticism. He wasn't very relevant as a minister of defense. There was a direct line between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the chief of staff. He didn't bring anything to the job because he didn't have any experience in that, but mainly he was attacked by his own base. So I think he had no choice in his mind to do that. But I think it's backfiring because everybody says that this is not leadership, this is not responsibility. He is stepping down when things are not settled yet in Gaza. It's like shirking his responsibility and deserting battle.
So is the majority feeling in Israel that he's made the decision for the wrong reasons? In other words, people would rather see a ceasefire than a more hardline stance?
Absolutely. I think that also, if you look at the government, at the Prime Minister and the IDF, they really were very restrained and they tried their best to really alleviate any sorrow and the plights, both for Israeli on our side of the border and the people of Gaza. And hopefully this will end this violence because quite honestly, if Hamas will not upkeep their word or the silence, then Israel will have no choice but to retaliate. I hope we'll not get to that point.
Mukhaymar, Hamas calls the resignation of Lieberman a victory for the resistance, but what practical difference could this resignation make to the Palestinian people?
Well, let's look at it from a different angle. The Palestinians in Gaza, the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have been under Israeli siege and blockade for more than 11 years now. Poverty is about 70% among the Palestinians. Unemployment is more than 43% of the working force in the Gaza Strip. Access and movement of the Palestinians in and out of the Gaza Strip is very limited. The Palestinians, too, when you look at it, have not too much to lose out of what happened over the past 48 hours. Now the Palestinians see the top of Israeli defense establishment going down is definitely the Hamas and the Palestinians look at this as a victory. If it's not a military victory, it's definitely a symbolic victory that Lieberman, who has been calling for the destruction of Hamas for many years, was unable even to defeat Hamas, not to get rid of Hamas or to uproot Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Lieberman, who was a Minister of Defense for 2 years, and I agree with Danny Ayalon that Lieberman did not really bring anything to the job, did not bring anything to the position as a Minister of Defense in Israel. He very much failed miserably to deal with Hamas, to deal with the so-called security threat coming out from Gaza. And at the end of the day, his government just last week approved the transfer of $15 million to Hamas and to transfer of fuel for the Gaza power station. So there is a big difference between what Lieberman has been calling for, the destruction of Hamas, and the behavior of his ministry and the behavior of the Israeli government, which has been giving more life support for Hamas and its government in Gaza. That's what it looks like from a Palestinian perspective, that the government of Israel has failed miserably in the face of Hamas and the face of Palestinian resistance.
Okay, before we look at the latest violence and the possible effects that may have on any potential peace, Omar, just lay out for us in terms of international law, in terms of human rights, about whether either side has any justification for attacking each other over the past couple of days.
Absolutely. There have been apparently unlawful attacks carried out both by the Israeli army and by Hamas forces. Of course, we're still investigating these incidents, but what's very clear to start with is that the Israeli army has a record of using excessive force when it comes to Gaza, not only in the wars of 2014 and 2012 and 2008, but even what we've seen in the way they've policed the March of Return, where they've opened fire subject to orders at the highest level of the Israeli government, including Defence Minister Avigdor Lieberman, with authorized using lethal force against demonstrators who did not pose an imminent threat to life, which is the standard that's set out in international law. And again, initial reports suggest that at least two of those that were killed may not have been, in fact, combatants. One apparently was a farmer, another that was attempting to climb the fence, but who didn't apparently pose an imminent threat to life, as initial reports suggest. And on the other side, firing rockets indiscriminately towards Israeli civilian centers is a clear war crime. These are indiscriminate weapons that are targeting population centers, and there is no cause that can justify such attacks. And quite simply, this is all happening, as my previous colleague mentioned, in the context of Israel's effective closure of Gaza. For 11 years, it has effectively enacted a travel ban, preventing the entry and exit of people of goods subject to humanitarian exemptions, effectively turning the 11 by 40-kilometer Gaza Strip into an open-air prison, restrictions that far exceed what's allowed under international law. We continue to see the same cycle continue. And just a last point on the Lieberman resignation, I would actually agree with both of the two previous speakers. In fact, the Israeli army and security establishment has been very clear that the closure does not serve Israel's security interests. In fact, the former head of the army in charge of Kogat, which oversees the Gaza Strip, called for a Marshall Plan of Gaza. But in fact, Lieberman has pursued a policy to tighten the closure, restricting electricity, goods, and movement of people in a way that doesn't serve Israel's security, much less meet the basic minimum threshold in international law.
Danny, just picking up on one point out of all of those that Omar has made there, Israel's policing of the border with Gaza. There's more than 200 Palestinians who have been killed, the thousands upon thousands who have been injured. The vast majority have been killed or wounded by live Israeli fire, and most of them are innocent civilians. Sure, they're protesting, but they're civilians.
Well, I would say that really the ultimate responsibility lies with Hamas. It is true that for 11 years there are issues from getting in and out, but why is it? 11 years ago, Israel withdrew from Gaza to the last inch.
Yeah, but Danny, we're talking about this particular issue. Danny, seriously, we're talking about this one particular issue. A young female nurse, you can't blame Hamas for her being killed by an Israeli soldier's rifle or whatever weapon it was, a bullet entering her body and her being killed. So therefore, the policing of that border and what's been going on for the past few months there, could that be the reason for the culmination of Hamas firing these rockets? Apart from the raid, which we have to talk about as well, but can you just address specifically the policing of that border and those more than 200 people killed and the thousands injured by live Israeli bullets?
Well, the policing of the border is quite legitimate with international law. The 55th article of the UN Charter is of self-defense. And again, we have been indiscriminately under fire. And we're talking about children and kindergartens and restaurants and so on and so forth. Yes, and also what we know that Hamas has sent their own people and pushed them towards our border, and also indiscriminately embedding among them some terrorists with firearms, with explosives, and some of them, just tried to cut, and some of them did manage actually to cut the fence on the border and just infiltrating into Israel. I don't think any country would have allowed that. We have had an arrangement with Hamas for the last 3-4 years, and last March they started with just pushing towards our borders, supposedly with the demonstrations, but that's okay. If they want to demonstrate, that's fine. They can do it in their own territory, but not in a menacing way with us. And I can tell you, our military and our government would really go out of their way to make sure that the Gazan people have all the the rights and privileges that they are, they are very much owed to and deserve as anyone else in the planet. But what is the problem? The problem is that the money that goes in and the cement and iron and all that is not used for building of schools or anything or buildings, but it is used for tunnels, underground tunnels, attack tunnels to infiltrate and attack Israelis and kidnap Israelis. The problem, the plight of the people of Gaza is because the Hamas is not ready to really do away with the terror, to demilitarize. Once they demilitarize Gaza, I can assure you, Gaza will be open. And by the way, it's not just Israel closing their borders against terrorism, it's also Egypt. Egypt, the Rafah passage is also closed. Why? Because Hamas attacks.
Okay. Mohammed, what do you say to that?
Well, let me say to Danny, do not twist international law to your advantage. International law is clear here. International law does not give Israel and Israeli soldiers and snipers the right to shoot Palestinian civilians. As it was presented in this program, more than 200 Palestinian civilians have been killed since the start of the March of Return on March 30th of this year. Many of those who have been killed and gunned down by Israeli snipers were Palestinian children under the age of 16. Some of those who were killed were 2 Palestinian journalists, 1 Palestinian paramedic, and even Palestinian handicapped like Ibrahim Abu Thuraya was also gunned down by Israeli snipers. There is no such thing, you call it international law, that give Israel the right to shoot against Palestinian civilians and Palestinian protesters. If Israel wants to twist international law, that's a different thing. If Israel wants to behave as a rouge state, that's a different thing. Let's look at it. There are 2 million Palestinians surrounded in what is being described as the biggest open-air prison in the world, with 2 million Palestinians in a very small area, no more than 365 square kilometers, with poverty, unemployment, lack of electricity, lack of potable water, lack of access and movement. And let's not put the blame on Egypt. Israel is, according to international law, Israel is the occupying power over Palestinian territory, and Israel must be held responsible for the well-being of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, as well as the other 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. To try to put the blame on Egypt and say that Egypt is also blocking its borders, this is not an Egyptian responsibility. This is the responsibility of the Israeli occupation. And again, the source of all of this is Israel. You started by saying that Israel withdrew from Gaza. If Israel, as you just mentioned, Israel withdrew its soldiers and settlers from the Gaza Strip in September of 2005, then what was the Israeli unit doing in Gaza 3 nights ago when an Israeli unit was infiltrating in Gaza at about 10 p.m. night time? What was it doing?
Mohammed,
if Israel had withdrawn from Gaza, then Israel and Israeli army had no business to be in Gaza.
Okay, Mohammed, Danny, could you just give us your idea of what the reasoning might be for a ground operation by Israeli intelligence forces into the Gaza Strip at this time when it looked as if the two sides might be coming to some kind of agreement?
Well, simply put, is just a preemptive measure against firing at our population, civil population. And again, I would like to remind Omar, since we left in 2005. No more occupation. You cannot say any occupation because we left to the green line, the international line. But since we left, we hope this would change the entire dynamics. We hope that the Palestinians would answer in kind and come into negotiations and have peace, since we have no occupation there in Gaza anymore. But since then, we have been fired upon 11,000 rockets. And just in the last 8-9 months, you know, it's about 1,500 rockets. So when you do that, you have sometimes to preempt and to make sure that our children and our civil populations will not be a danger. Believe me, I do not want to see any siege on Gaza. I would like to see Gaza open like any other place. Somebody in the past said that Gaza really could be like the Singapore of the Mediterranean or of the Middle East, you know, because of its location and its beautiful beaches and sea and port and everything like that. I hope things will happen. But if Hamas would, you know, put down the arms and start really investing in the population, in the economy, in social programs, and will not push their people into our borders, then I think we will be in a much different position.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left. Omar, give us an idea from your organization's point of view and other international organizations where they, as neutrals, see common ground between the two sides that may eventually be able to revitalize some kind of process that we have been witnessing in the past few months between Israel and Hamas.
The first point to make here is, according to the UN, the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, most of the entire world, Gaza remains occupied by Israel. Israel controls the airspace, the water space, the borders, the entry and exit of goods. It controls the VAT tax. It controls a large no-go zone. It still registers every Palestinian baby born in the Gaza Strip as part of its population registry. The fallacy that Israel left and withdrew is simply untrue. It still maintains full effective control over the Gaza Strip. Danny mentions that this is all about security, but for many years, for example, Israel didn't allow the entrance in of margarine, industrial-sized margarine. It wasn't because margarine was going into tunnels or being fired as rockets. It was because it was part of a failed political strategy to starve Hamas. The cookie factory in Gaza was considered linked to Hamas elements. The point of the story is that's a failed political strategy, Lieberman being one of the main architects of it, and it was not based on Israeli security, which is why Israel's security establishment has been one of the largest advocates for opening up Gaza. Just another example, Israel allows tomatoes and eggplants to be exported out of Gaza, but not other fruit and vegetables. There is simply no security-based reason. Or tomorrow, someone from Gaza can potentially get a permit to do a surgery outside of Gaza, but if the next week, if they apply for a permit to study abroad or to attend go on vacation, they will be rejected because the closure policy doesn't let anyone in or out.
Okay,
the
just
first step,
in 30 seconds, Omar, where's the common ground? Is there any common ground? Very briefly.
It's ending the closure of Gaza in favor, opening up Gaza in favor of restrictions that are only based, instead of a generalized ban on travel, based solely on security considerations. End the closure of Gaza now.
Okay, and Danny, presumably you don't think that could ever happen unless Hamas lays down its weapons. Again, very briefly.
Well, yeah, I would like to see Gaza opened and the airspace and ports and everything else. But as long as you have these underground tunnels, as long as you have these launchers, as long as you have these rockets, and also these terrorist squads, what can you do? If they would lay down their arms, believe me, we would be very happy to see Gaza flourish. And I remember that when we left Gaza, it was the Palestinian Authority that took over. And then in a coup, Hamas threw out the Palestinian Authority. So this adds to the complexity of the situation. But if Gaza would be clean of terror and explosives, I have no doubt the Israeli government the next morning would open everything up.
Danny Mechaimer, Omar, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, it's the capital of the most powerful democracy in the world. So why were residents of Washington, D.C. left out of the midterm elections? And could Donald Trump hand over the Afghan war to American mercenaries? We'll look at efforts being made by the former Blackwater CEO, Eric Prince. A record 110 million Americans voted for their representatives in Congress last week, unless you are from Washington, D.C. It's a fact that's widely condemned by observers of international law. People in the district don't have representation in either the House or the Senate. So how can nearly 700,000 people live in the world's most powerful capital but not have a voice in their own legislature. Natalie Pahonen explains.
Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States of America. You probably knew that, but did you know people in D.C. don't have a voting representative in the U.S. Congress? That's because, like Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C. is not a state. This is what some people in D.C. have to say about that.
I feel like D.C. should be a state. Virginia's a state. Maryland's a state. Why we gotta leave out D.C.? Like, we got the DMV, D.C. Like, we are our own people too. We have our rights. Why can't we be a state, right?
We're, well over 500,000 people. We don't have national representation, and that's pretty frustrating.
I think the way the system is, I think it's fine. We still vote for municipal elections, local leaders.
Yeah, to me the most important thing is having my vote count, being represented in Congress, and our representatives should have a vote, not like this fake representative that we have now.
She's talking about Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the delegate for DC in the House of Representatives. But because DC is not a state, she is not allowed to vote in the House.
In the District of Columbia, we are asking to become the 51st state of the United States of America. We think we have more than earned it. The people who live in your nation's capital are #1 per capita in taxes paid to support the United States of America, talking about earning statehood.
Washington, D.C. became the U.S. capital in 1790. The district's status is enshrined in the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The country's founders were concerned that people living in the capital could unduly influence Congress because of their proximity to the seat of government. It also means the U.S. Congress has jurisdiction over the district. Calls for DC statehood date back more than 200 years. Is it now time to give the district's American citizens full voting rights? Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
And to discuss this, let's go to our guests in the U.S. Capitol. Walter Smith is the Executive Director of the D.C. Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Hans von Spakovsky manages the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. Walter, we have to start with you because you've launched a lawsuit to get full representation in Congress for D.C. Why have you done that? How have you done that? What's the basis for your legal argument?
Well, we've done that because people who live in the nation's capital have been without voting representation, believe it or not, since the founding of the capital in 1801. The rest of the country went to the polls last week to elect their voting representatives, but people who live in the capital didn't do that. So they instead went to court to try to get equal rights. The argument is that it violates the U.S. Constitution in that it denies a fundamental right to U.S. citizens who pay their taxes, obey the laws, go to war, but have no voting representation in the U.S. Congress. And the lawsuit says that this violates equal protection, violates the Due Process Clause, and violates the First Amendment to the Constitution.
In 1978, you'll know this very well, there was a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution to do exactly this, to give voting rights to Congress people elected for D.C. And it didn't pass. It wasn't ratified by enough states. Only 16 out of the 38 ratifications were received. But this is slightly different, what you're doing. Is this the first time a lawsuit has been filed with this intent?
Well, it's the first time a lawsuit has been filed which says that the Congress of the United States can simply pass a law giving the people in the district the vote. You are right that in 1978 an effort was made to amend the Constitution, but since then the Congress, both in 2007 and 2009, passed bills indicating that in fact Congress has the authority to simply pass through simple legislation a law that would give district residents a vote. So this is different from the constitutional amendment that was tried. It's different from the earlier lawsuit. It's a much simpler way to get at it, and we think it's a very strong argument.
Hans, what about the legal issues here? Unconstitutional, probably even against international law, which allows every citizen of the world to have representation in their domestic legislature, and people in D.C. don't.
Yeah, but you have to understand.
Well, that is true.
If you look at our original Constitution, you'll see that the nation's capital was set up as the government seat and as an insular district. It was supposed to be autonomous. It was not supposed to be subject to pressure from any state government. So this is in the Constitution itself. And this issue legally has already been decided. In 2000, a lawsuit was filed claiming that the lack of representation in Congress was a violation of the Constitution, equal protection, and those other provisions. The federal district court said, no, it is not a violation. It is not a problem under the Constitution. And that decision was affirmed, called Adams v. Clinton, by the United States Supreme Court. So the issue has already been decided. The only way the district could be made a state and therefore have representation is through a constitutional amendment. That's already been tried, as you mentioned, and the states did not approve it.
Walter?
Well, that's actually not true. The earlier lawsuit addressed the issue only of whether or not district residents could be treated as residents of a state within the meaning of Article 1, Section 2. We now understand under that court ruling we cannot be treated as residents of state under Article 1, Section 2. However, as I said before, after that decision came down, the Congress of the United States decided that even though we're not residents of a state, it has the authority under what's called the District Clause to give us the vote nevertheless. And what makes this argument that they need to do that so strong is that Congress has already treated other people who don't live in states as being entitled to voting representation. That includes people who once lived in states and moved overseas, or people who live in what are called federal enclaves, which are military bases, national parks, and the like. So the central argument in this new lawsuit is that it violates equal protection for Congress to allow voting representation to other people who don't live in states, which the Congress has done, but to deny that voting representation to people who live in the district. So it's very different from the first lawsuit. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment because Congress has already said it has the authority through simple legislation to confer the vote.
Okay, Hans, the legal argument aside, really, honestly, if you look at it from the outside, if you're not an American, people will be wondering, hold on, this isn't anything super controversial. We're not talking about gun laws here. We're not talking about illegal narcotics. We're talking about people being given the right to vote and to have a representative inside the legislature who will speak for them. Why? Why would anybody be against that?
You look at the original debates in our Constitutional Convention, as I've said, the framers of the Constitution said they wanted the nation's capital not to be subject to the pressures of a state government. The only way under the Constitution that the District of Columbia can be given voting rights is if it is made a state. That requires a constitutional amendment. Congress cannot do it. And anyone who doubts that, all you have to do, you can Google the case I was talking about, Adams v. Clinton, and you will see that all of these issues were dealt with in that decision, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court. So you can't do this through a lawsuit. And I actually think that the original arguments about this are still correct today. You don't want the Washington, D.C. and the Congress to be subject to potential pressure from the local government. If people want to be able to vote, they have an easy way to do that. They can move into one of the surrounding states, and there they have voting rights. It certainly doesn't in any way hurt the district when it comes to federal money When it comes to the dollars per resident, Washington, D.C. gets more money than a majority of the states around the country. That's
look, presumably
that's just part of our Constitution, the way the government was designed, and there isn't any reason to change it.
Yeah, but presumably that also means that people who live in D.C. earn a lot more money than the average American national. But you're saying 700,000 people should leave D.C. if they want those kind of rights to be represented inside Congress.
No, what I'm saying is they made a decision to move into the district, and under our Constitution, which has existed for more than 200 years, this was the design that was put into it, and there isn't any reason to change it today.
Walter?
Well, can I just respond to this? The framers of our Constitution certainly never intended that this great democracy they were creating would exclude from that democracy the people who lived in the nation's capital. When the Constitution was written, the intent of the framers was that everyone who lived in the country would be represented in the Congress. The problem arose in that when the Constitution was written, the nation's capital had not yet been created. It was created several years later out of portions of states. But the idea that we would be the only nation's capital in the world that would deny democracy to those who lived here is completely foreign to the original concept of the framers of our Constitution.
That is not true. That is not true. You can look at the history of the Constitutional Convention. You can look at the notes that James Madison took. Congress very specifically gave representation in Congress only to states. And they very specifically said that the District of Columbia, it's not a state, so it doesn't fall within the congressional representation as outlined in the rest of the Constitution. And the notes from the debates show that that is just not the case.
How much does this fall?
Wait a minute. No.
Go on, Walter.
You're confusing two different things here. The fact that they were trying to give representation only to people who lived in states does not mean that they intended that when the nation's capital was later created out of two portions of states, that the framers intended that people who lived in the nation's capital wouldn't have voting representation. And I need to respond to something else the gentleman said a minute ago. It is not true that statehood for the district could be created only through a constitutional amendment. Statehood could be created as one way to give voting representation to people who live in the district through simple legislation. Under our Constitution, new states are created.
It cannot. The District of Columbia is specifically set out in the Constitution. You have to change the Constitution to do that. That's why in 1961, it took a constitutional amendment to give the residents of the district the ability to vote for president. But the provisions in the Constitution which define who has representation in Congress specifically refer to states, not the District of Columbia.
Okay, do you mind if we just look at the politics?
No one is disagreeing with that.
Okay, can we just look at the politics of this? Hans, how much does this break down along partisan lines between Republicans and Democrats, right? Because I think most people know who follow U.S. politics that D.C. is a very democratic district. If it were to become a state, it would probably elect Democrats to the House and the Senate. How important is that, and how much does that mean Republicans are against this change?
No, I think what Republicans are saying is that if you're going to do this, you have to do it through a constitutional convention. And the fact that the 1977 constitutional amendment that was passed by Congress and then sent to the states was only approved by such a small number of states shows you that even Democratic states did not want to approve it, because there were more than 16 Democratic states at that time, and yet they weren't approving of this change either.
Walter, do you think Republicans are scared what might happen if your desired change came about?
Well, can I just say something on this issue? In our view, this should not be a partisan issue. The right of all Americans to have full voting representation in the Congress should not depend on whether or not they're Democrats or Republicans. And I think it's worth noting, as I tried to mention a minute ago, that in 2007 and again in 2009, simple legislation passed both houses of Congress that would have given voting representation at that time only in the House of Representatives to people who live in the district. So we've already established that Congress has the authority to do this. It's because they've refused to do it since then that we've brought a lawsuit saying that it denies equal protection for them to fail to do it.
Hans, is it fair to say that actually this change we're talking about, that's the subject of the lawsuit, would actually be good for the people of DC, which has, in the entire United States, some of the highest rates of HIV, of crime, of joblessness, that it would actually help the people who live there?
No, I don't think you can make that assumption because the District of Columbia government has been notoriously badly run. Ever since home rule was granted to D.C., they have limited home rule. They're able to elect their own members of their city council and mayor. The city has been known for many years as one of the worst run cities in the country. So the idea that somehow giving it representation in Congress is somehow going to improve the efficiency of the local government, I mean, you've got no evidence to show that whatsoever.
Walter?
Well, I have to respond to that. I mean, the District of Columbia government is currently one of the best managed cities in the country and has been running surpluses for many years, has accomplished a great deal in the last decade or so. But again, in our view, the issue is not whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The issue is not whether or not the city is well run or not well run. We don't judge people's ability to have voting representation in their legislatures based on how well their local government may be run or whether or not they're Democrat or Republican. If we started doing that, there would be a whole lot of folks in the United States that wouldn't have voting representation. Our view is that this country was founded on the proposition of no taxation without representation and on the view that we would have a government that was run based on the consent of the governed. The District of Columbia is the only capital of any democracy in the world that denies voting representation in its national legislature to the citizens of its nation's capital. And the good news is, now that we know Congress has the authority to address this long-standing inequity, the courts have the authority to hold the refusal to give us the vote unconstitutional, and I hope and think that is what the courts will do.
Walter, we shall see what happens with your lawsuit. Walter and Hans, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Very interesting. Eric Prince, the businessman behind the private security firm Blackwater, has a strategy to get the United States out of Afghanistan, hand over the conflict to his new company. Prince wants to use his private army to support Afghan forces. He even pitched the idea to the Trump administration. He says the proposal will save lives and cost a fraction of what Washington is currently spending. Prince also believes Afghanistan's rare earth minerals could pay for the entire operation. Well, joining me now from occupied East Jerusalem is journalist Anthony Lowenstein. He's published an investigative piece on Eric Prince's Afghanistan proposal. It's available at trtworld.com. Anthony, thank you very much indeed for your time. Why is this so controversial, considering actually the Afghan war has been partially privatized already?
Well, there's no doubt that since the US invaded in October 2001, the war has been partly privatised, and the effect of that on civilian lives has been devastating. However, what Eric Prince is trying to do here is even worse. What he's trying to do is two things. One, privatise the war. He claims that thousands of private mercenaries can essentially do what the US military has not been able to do in 17 years of war. It's the longest war in US history. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of Afghan forces dying every week in this war. The Taliban has never been more powerful. But the other part of this story, which I investigated for TRT, as you say, was Prince has plans to try to exploit the country's resources. He has the Trump administration behind him. All of this is done covertly, I might add. He wants to try to exploit lithium and gold and rare earths in a diluted plan to be able to somehow profit, obviously, for his own company, but also what he claims is to give Afghan jobs. But this sort of plan, having spent time in Afghanistan and meeting some of these communities who would be affected, it would worsen violence, not make it any better.
Do we know what Donald Trump thinks about this? We know, don't we, that the Pentagon has said this is definitely not a good idea. But what about the president and his close advisors?
Well, Trump himself has not commented about Prince, but what he has done is spoken very openly and positively about the idea of exploiting the country's resources. What Trump has said since he's become president is contradictory in typical Trump style. On the one hand, he says basically, why is the US still in Afghanistan? And I would argue that's a very fair question. However, he's still sending more troops, and he's certainly open to the idea of privatising part of the war, even more so, and potentially exploiting its resources. So in the last year or so, in 2017, we know he met a number of private companies in the US who are open to doing that. When Prince went to Afghanistan this year, in January and September, as my reporting shows, he was going, quote, as Trump's advisor. That was what the security company that Prince used claimed Prince was there as. In other words, he was doing almost like an unofficial job to support what Trump believed in. So Trump, I think, believes the US could stay in Afghanistan if American companies could make money from the war. So Afghan civilians, of course, are caught in the middle and would suffer hugely if his plan came to fruition.
It sounds a bit counterintuitive to say that there's a military presence in Afghanistan to ensure peace. Do you get any sort of sense that Prince has an idea about how his private army might bring peace to Afghanistan? Or, if you're having very dark thoughts, you may believe that actually it would suit his purposes for war to continue.
Well, look, Prince himself has spoken openly about how he believes that privatising the war would somehow end the war, beat the Taliban, and the US can walk away with its head held high. But the truth is that that would completely not be based on any kind of fact. Any Afghan you speak to, and I speak to Afghans in Afghanistan constantly, are petrified of this idea because violence against civilians has never been worse. And in fact, many of the areas where private mercenaries have been operating in Afghanistan since October 2001, either run by Americans or Afghans, violence in fact has got worse. And some of the most disturbing parts of what I reported about Prince's plans to try to exploit the country's resources shows that the areas where he would like to exploit minerals, including both his own company and others, are often controlled by the Taliban or ISIS. So the idea somehow that you're going to have to use private militias or pay off warlords to somehow access these areas is completely delusional. And yet, as you rightly ask, is that what Prince actually wants? At the moment, Trump has rejected the plans to privatise the war. So far, that might change, and many people in Afghanistan are hoping that it does not change. But certainly Trump seems very open to the idea of privatising the resources. And in fact, Afghanistan has got anywhere between $1 to $4 trillion US of resources under the ground. It's a huge wealth. But arguably, as anyone who spent time in Afghanistan will tell you, exploiting those resources is going to make the war a lot worse. So Prince's plan should definitely be questioned and rejected, as the Ghani government has currently done in Afghanistan, although other forces within the Afghan government seem much more open to his ideas.
Has Prince thought through any of the legal issues here? Imagine if that private army were to commit any crimes, if, God forbid, it was involved in any extrajudicial killings. What if civilians are killed in a fight just being nearby a conflict that involves those troops? What would happen in that case?
Well, the truth is that since September 11, of course, we've seen many, many wars privatised. Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of the Syrian war and elsewhere. And the truth is that private mercenaries operate in a sort of legal-free zone. There really has been little to no accountability for US mercenaries, Australian mercenaries, British mercenaries operating. There are a few cases of a few legal trials in the US and elsewhere of private mercenaries being held to account, but in the vast majority of cases they're not. So an individual might commit a crime, kill somebody, torture someone in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they're often then taken out of the country back to the US and often protected. There are, as I said, a few examples where former Prince colleagues from Blackwater, the company he founded, had been put on trial in the US for committing war crimes in Iraq. But even then, the trial has lasted for many, many years without any real concrete conclusion. So the truth is, Prince knows that this was happening long before Trump came into power, and now with Trump as US president, he really has no, I think, qualms about putting forward a proposal where his forces would be protected just by virtue of the fact that it's Erik Prince. It's a very worrying development.
Anthony Lowenstein, we appreciate the contribution. Thank you very much. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.